10 miles off the French coast, a British submarine stealthily broke the surface in the darkness. 13 Royal Marines climbed out into the freezing spray and began retrieving something strange out of the torpedo hatches. 6 items in total, small enough to fit through the 24-inch openings and thin enough to tear. The Marines' target was 70 miles upriver, a German coastal fortress in Bordeaux. In the port, 32 Kriegsmarine patrol vessels lay hidden in concrete pens the RAF's bombers couldn't crack, while 25,000 tons of war materials moved through its docks every year. Germany believed the location was unreachable. Whatever was now in the water was the last thing they were ever expecting. December 7th, 1942. The Atlantic off the French coast, 10 miles out, black water and winter swells. HMS Tuna broke surface in the darkness, seawater streaming off her hull. 13 Royal Marines climbed out into the freezing spray. They started hauling 6 canvas kayaks up through the hatches, collapsible things, barely more than frames and fabric. The Bay of Biscay heaved beneath them. They worked fast. Every second on the surface was a second for a German patrol boat to spot them, or a plane, or a searchlight to catch the wet steel of the conning tower. Speed was the only thing keeping them alive. Major Herbert Hasler, Blondie to everyone who knew him, though his pale hair was hidden now under a greased wool cap, watched his men and said nothing. At 32, he was an experienced sailor, boat designer, and Royal Marine officer, with an obsessive belief in an unconventional idea, that small teams in tiny boats could accomplish what whole fleets could not. Tonight, he would prove it or die trying. As Lieutenant Commander Dick Rakes of the Tuna later recalled, the commandos looked like, quote, magnificent black-faced villains as they prepared to disappear into enemy waters. Their faces were blackened, their gears strapped tight, their eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Their mission was codenamed Operation Frankton, and it read like a suicide pact. Paddle nearly 70 miles up the Gironde River, infiltrate the Nazi-held port of Bordeaux, one of the most heavily defended harbors in occupied Europe. Attach magnetic mines to German cargo ships, escape overland through 100 miles of hostile territory to neutral Spain. The entire journey would take days. The plan was straightforward. Paddle under the cover of night, lie low when the sun was up, and pray the Germans wouldn't spot them. There was no support waiting for them inland, no extraction route planned. A classic down-and-dirty commando mission. Why Bordeaux? When France fell in 1940, the Allies lost more than territory. The problems kept compounding, month after month. Germany could now employ French harbors to launch U-boat attacks on Allied convoys traversing the Atlantic, and containing these naval assaults had proven impossible with the enemy navy no longer boxed in the North Sea. In the year before the raid, more than 25,000 tons of crude rubber had come through Bordeaux, enough to keep Wehrmacht trucks rolling across 3 continents. The stuff moved through the harbor locks, alongside tungsten for armor-piercing shells and quinine to keep German soldiers alive in the tropics. Every shipment that made it through was fuel for the war machine. German cargo vessels docked there and preparing to depart with critical war supplies, including advanced aircraft components, bound for Imperial Japan via blockade runner. The harbor bristled with coastal guns and was patrolled by no fewer than 32 Kriegsmarine vessels. A conventional assault would have been butchery, but these men weren't conventional. Each 2-man kayak, called a cockle and stretching just 15 feet long with canvas sides, carried 8 magnetic limpet mines, rations for several days, 45 caliber 1911 pistol, a combat knife, and a grenade. The mines were designed to work underwater. Though they carried only about 2 kilograms of explosives each, the pressure released in the blast could carve a gaping hole through armored steel. The specialized devices attached magnetically to ship hulls and were triggered by an ampule of acetone that slowly dissolved a plastic washer, giving the commandos a limited window to escape before detonation. Hasler had warned his volunteers that their, quote, expectation of a long life was very remote if they joined this mission. All 13 still volunteered. Now, as the kayak slipped off the submarine's deck and into the black estuary, those odds felt very real. The idea had seemed absurd when Hasler first pitched it to the British brass in early 1942. canoes against the Kriegsmarine, foldable boats against U-boat pens and fortified harbors. The Royal Navy thought he was a crank. Too many years tinkering with his small boats, too many weekends lost to obscure sailing races. Attack a fortified port 70 miles up a German-controlled river with just a handful of men paddling canvas canoes. It was laughable. Hasler didn't care. He'd spent decades building and sailing these things. He knew defenses designed to stop battleships and bombers weren't built for kayaks. Mines, nets, radars, and coastal emplacements meant little to a tiny boat. A fleet couldn't breach the harbor, but a few men in tiny boats sliding upriver in the dark. That might just work. The brass didn't see it. Hasler cursed their short vision under his breath and moved on. Everything changed in December 1941, when Italian frogmen from the Dittima Flotilla MAS unit infiltrated the port of Alexandria aboard tiny manned torpedoes. The Italian commandos delivered an overwhelming blow to the Royal Navy, damaging the battleships HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant in what became one of the most humiliating attacks of the Mediterranean campaign. The assault proved what small boats could actually do against targets everyone assumed were untouchable. Hasler's crazy idea was starting to look like a serious naval warfare strategy. By July 1942, the Boom Patrol Detachment came into existence under his command. 34 men training in canoe handling, demolitions, and how to move unseen up enemy rivers. The standard folding canoes were useless, though. They tore too easily, couldn't handle rough water, and didn't have the capacity for a long mission behind enemy lines. So Hasler designed his own. Bigger, tougher, built to survive days of hard paddling through hostile territory. He collaborated with Fred Goatley of Saunders Row to engineer a working paradox, the Mark II cockle. Unlike standard kayaks, it featured a flat marine plywood bottom for dragging over mud that could fold down to a mere 7 inches in height, the exact clearance needed to shove it through a submarine's 24-inch torpedo hatch. Hasler submitted his formal attack plan on September 21, 1942. Admiral Louis Mountbatten, Churchill's chief of combined operations, reviewed the proposal and approved it 3 weeks later on October 13th. Mountbatten made 2 critical adjustments. He doubled the force from 3 kayaks to 6, quote, in case of accidents, a precaution that would prove grimly prescient. And he initially forbade Hasler from participating in the raid, deeming the experienced major too valuable to risk on what everyone acknowledged was likely a one-way mission. Hasler was livid. He would not stay behind to push pencils while men risked their lives on his boats. He argued that no one else possessed his expertise in small craft operations, that his men needed him on the water, that a commander who designed the mission should lead it. The volunteers knew exactly what they were signing up for. When Hasler asked Marine Bill Sparks why he wanted to join such hazardous duty, Sparks replied simply, quote, "To avenge my brother, sir." Marine Robert Ewart wrote a letter to his fiancée, to be delivered if he fell during the mission, describing the operation simply as, quote, "this little adventure," adding, quote, "keep your chin up, sweetheart." Every man on the team carried a similar weight. They also knew about Hitler's Commando Order, issued 2 months earlier, which demanded the immediate execution of any Allied commandos captured by German forces. No prisoner status, no Geneva Convention protections, just a bullet. They went anyway. Throughout autumn 1942, Hasler's hand-picked Marines endured a training program designed to break ordinary men and forge something harder. Punishing daily assault courses sent many candidates to the hospital with injuries ranging from sprains to fractures. Those who couldn't handle the physical demands were quietly removed. Those who remained faced the relentless, repetitive drilling that can barely begin to prepare them to face impossible odds. Endless paddling drills built the endurance to stroke through hostile waters for hours without rest, maintaining rhythm and direction while fighting wild currents. The men learned to read water and the subtle signs of tidal change like a book. They practiced capsizing the kayaks, and themselves back in within seconds. They ran mock raids until they could move through hostile ground without making a sound. The training included evasion exercises in which men were dropped in the countryside with no money or supplies, in orders to reach a specific rendezvous point without being captured by local police, playing the role of German patrols. The final test was a full dress rehearsal on home turf. They launched from Margate and paddled up the River Swale toward Deptford in the Thames estuary. It was roughly the same distance and conditions they'd face on the Gironde. They slipped past mock sentries, planted dummy charges on moored ships, and got out without anyone spotting them. The exercise proved they could execute the mission. By late November, Hasler was confident his men were ready. He divided his raiders into two sections, designated A and B divisions. A division comprised 3 kayaks: Catfish, crewed by Hasler himself, and Marine Bill Sparks; Crayfish, with Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills; and Conger, manned by Corporal George Sheard and Marine David Moffat. B division included Cuttlefish, under Lieutenant John McKinnon and Marine James Conway; Coalfish, with Sergeant Samuel Wallace and Marine Robert Ewart; and Cachalot, crewed by Marines W.A. Ellery and E. Fisher. Marine Norman Colley stood ready as reserve, prepared to replace any man unable to proceed. On November 30th, 1942, HMS Tuna slipped out of Holy Loch, Scotland, carrying the 6 canvas canoes and 13 commandos into the Atlantic. The journey to France would take a week. Disaster struck before they even cleared the submarine. As the crew hauled Cachalot through the forward hatch, the canvas hull caught on the metal frame and tore a long, ragged gash that opened the kayak's belly to the sea. The damage was fatal and irreparable in the time available. Marines Ellery and Fisher stared at their destroyed craft, and their comrades were already paddling away. They had to be left behind. Months of preparing their minds, bodies, and souls for the pivotal moments of their lives suddenly vanished. The original force of 12 men in 6 canoes was now 10 men in 5. They hadn't even reached the river. At 7:30 that night, the 5 remaining kayaks pushed out into the Gironde. The dark swallowed them right up. The river fought back as soon as they came in. The winter currents created these massive, chaotic patches of water, overfalls, where the tides just slammed into the sandbars. Waves crested 5 feet high in the pitch black. You couldn't see them until they were breaking against your boat. The men were struggling just to keep their bows pointed into the swells. Their arms were burning, lungs pumping. A sudden sideways wave capsized the kayak Conger, instantly plunging Corporal Sheard and Marine Moffat into the frigid December Atlantic. They surfaced, gasping in the stabbing cold. Although he witnessed the disaster, Hasler made the brutal decision to continue the mission without them, ordering Conger to be scuttled to prevent its discovery from alerting the Germans. The 2 drenched men clung to the remaining boats as long as their grip held, but hypothermia was already shutting down their systems. Eventually, they had to swim for shore. Sheard and Moffat made it to land. They did not survive the night. Their comrades paddled on. In the chaos of navigating the overfalls, Coalfish vanished. Hasler's group searched frantically, scanning the heaving darkness for any sign of Sergeant Wallace and Marine Ewart, but it was futile. Now down to 3 kayaks, the surviving commandos pressed on toward the river mouth and directly into the teeth of German defenses. Searchlights cut through the darkness ahead. The silhouettes of 4 enemy frigates guarding the estuary materialized like nightmares made solid. The command immediately went flat, pressing their faces against the kayaks, their paddles stroking with agonizing slowness, their bodies blending with boats so they looked like not much more than a floating log. Minutes stretched into eternities. The German sentries scanned the surface, their lights sweeping back and forth across the water where British Marines lay frozen, barely breathing. They slipped through, but in navigating around the German patrol, Cuttlefish became separated from the others. Lieutenant McKinnon and Marine Conway paddled to a different shore, unable to rejoin the main force in the darkness. They would begin trekking south on foot, attempting to reach Spain through 100 miles of occupied territory. After several days on the run, French collaborators betrayed them to German forces. Both men were captured, interrogated, and executed under Hitler's Commando Order. Meanwhile, at dawn, Wallace and Ewart from the missing Coalfish stumbled ashore near Point de Grave, only to be immediately surrounded by German soldiers. They, like their comrades, would face the firing squad. Their mission was barely underway, and 6 lives had already been lost. By the time pale light crept over the estuary on December 8th, the toll was staggering. Of the original 10 men who had launched from the tuna, only 4 remained operational: Hasler and Sparks in catfish, Laver and Mills in crayfish. Several miles of river still stretched between them and Bordeaux. They hid through the daylight hours, concealed among reeds and marshy banks where the river met the land in tangles of vegetation and mud. The kayak's camouflage paint blended with the winter foliage, rendering them nearly invisible to eyes on the water or aircraft overhead. When darkness fell, they paddled. The night of December 8th through 9th brought them roughly 22 miles upriver, every stroke a desperate fight against the current that wanted to push them back toward the sea. The following night, they gained another 15 miles. They were closing on the target, but the river wasn't finished testing them. On the 4th night, December 10th through 11th, a fierce tide turned the Gironde into a stubborn beast. The men paddled for hours and covered just 9 miles, barely walking pace. Hasler did the calculations in the darkness. They wouldn't reach Bordeaux in time for the original attack window. The plan called for synchronizing with the tide and the moon, for hitting the harbor at the precise moment when conditions favored approach and escape. That window was closing. He made the call: lie low an extra day, rest, repair gear, and prepare for a strike on the night of December 11th. He would deal with the consequences of the decision later. As they rested, the men assembled their limpet mines, checking fuses and magnetic clamps. They calibrated the fuses with shaking hands, selecting the red-coated ampules for a 9-hour delay. Once attached, a simple thumb screw would crush the glass, releasing acetone to eat through a celluloid disc. A silent chemical countdown that no sonar could detect. When evening came, a moonless sky stretched overhead, clear and black and perfect for the work of sabotage. The river lay calm for the first time in days. Hasler gave the signal. The 2 kayaks slipped from their hiding spots and began the final approach. Just after 9 p.m. on December 11th, 1942, Operation Frankton reached its climax. The 2 kayaks paddled silently into the heart of Bordeaux's harbor, passing beneath the hulls of enemy vessels, slipping between patrol boats. The harbor they'd studied from every angle in planning tables now surrounded them. Ships, cranes, dock lights, armed guards, the entire apparatus of Nazi naval operations stretching in every direction. Hasler and Sparks maneuvered catfish along the western quay, scanning the darkness for threats. Working quickly and silently, they approached their first target, a German cargo ship at anchor. Hasler reached down to the waterline, pressed the magnetic limpet against the steel hull, and felt it lock into place. They moved to the next position, another mine, then another. 8 charges attached to 4 vessels in succession, each placement requiring the kayak to slide directly alongside enemy ships, where discovery was a real possibility. On the eastern side of the port, Corporal Laver and Marine Mills in crayfish initially found no targets at their assigned position. The ships they'd expected to find had apparently moved or never existed. Instead of quitting, Laver and Mills pushed further upriver instead, paddling deeper into enemy territory toward the auxiliary anchorage at Bassan. There, they discovered 2 moored vessels, a large cargo steamer and a smaller liner. They placed 5 mines on the steamer, 3 on the liner. At one point, a German sentry on deck spotted movement in the water and trained his flashlight toward catfish. The beam swept across the surface, hunting. Hasler and Sparks froze. The kayak drifted, camouflaged and low. 2 men pressed flat against canvas suddenly felt paper thin, watching the light approach with the terrible certainty that discovery was here. The light paused, moved left, then away. The sentry had seen something, but not enough to raise an alarm. The Marines remained invisible by millimeters, by luck, by whatever providence watches over men who go to war in canoes. By 12:45 a.m., the work was done. 16 mines placed on 6 German vessels. The 4 commandos began paddling downstream, putting distance between themselves and the devastation scheduled to arrive in roughly 15 hours. Now came the hardest part of the mission: getting out alive. The 2 kayaks rendezvoused by chance at Ile Cazeau, several miles downriver from the harbor, where 16 mines lay waiting to detonate. By 6 a.m. on December 12th, they'd covered about 20 miles and come ashore near the village of Saint-Genès-de-Blé. The exhausted Marines dragged their cockle boats onto the bank one final time, then set about destroying them. They slashed the canvas, smashed the wooden frames, scattered the pieces, and buried what remained, eliminating any trace of their presence that might help German investigators piece together what had happened or how. Then they shook hands, they wished each other luck, and went their separate ways in their ordeal to reach Spain. Hasler and Sparks headed in one direction, Laver and Mills set off in another. Behind them, unseen, the acetone fuses continued dissolving plastic washers, counting down toward the moment when Bordeaux harbor would be rocked to its core. 15 hours after the commandos escaped, the harbor erupted. The mines detonated in a cascading orchestra of destruction, each explosion feeding confusion and panic into the next. Massive gaping holes tore through steel hulls. Ships that had been preparing to ferry war materials across the globe now lay flooded, listing, sinking, transforming into wreckage. 2 vessels went down entirely. 4 others sustained crippling damage that would take months to repair. Nazi commanders couldn't understand what had happened. Adolf Hitler was furious that the toy boat raid had penetrated his vaunted defenses. The Führer's rage echoed through occupied France as German security forces launched a frantic hunt for the saboteurs who had somehow slipped through every defensive measure and struck at will. Roadblocks went up across the region, patrols intensified, and locals were tortured and surveilled. Laver and Mills hid for 2 days before their luck ran out. Vichy French gendarmes discovered them at Montier-la-Garde, exhausted, starving, and confused. The gendarmes turned them in to the Germans. Both Marines were interrogated, transported to Paris, and executed by firing squad in March 1943. They died without breaking, without betraying their comrades, without revealing anything useful to their captors. The Commando Order had claimed 2 more. Hasler and Sparks traveled at night with the help of locals who asked few questions. On December 18th, 11 days after leaving the submarine, they finally reached the town of Ruffec. With no alternatives and desperate for food, Hasler made one last risky bet. He entered the Hotel Toque Blanche, chin up, and ordered a hot bowl of soup. As he ate, he secretly passed a note to the owner of the venue. Madame Mandinot could have turned them in. Instead, she put them in touch with the resistance. That's how they met Mary Lindell, an Englishwoman running an escape line for Allied soldiers under the codename Marie Claire. She and her teenage son hid the Marines on a remote farm for 2 weeks while the German search parties wore themselves out. When things quieted down, they led the men on foot across the Pyrenees into Spain. Both Marines were already wrecked. The mountain crossing in the middle of a harsh winter nearly finished them. By early 1943, Hasler and Sparks were in British hands. Of the 10 men who had launched from the Tuna on that freezing December night, they alone survived. Hasler was flown back to Britain in April 1943, arriving 116 days after departure. Sparks followed by sea a few months later. Both received military honors. Hasler the Distinguished Service Order, Sparks the Distinguished Service Medal. Neither man received the Victoria Cross. The technicality was almost absurd. They were never fired upon by the enemy. They'd paddled into one of the most fortified harbors in Nazi Europe, blown up 6 ships, escaped through 100 miles of occupied France, and survived when 8 of their friends did not. But no German had actually shot at them, so the highest honor was off the table. The military results were mixed. The mine sank 2 ships and damaged 4 others, but Bordeaux's harbor was shallow. The Germans raised and repaired most of the vessels within months. And there was another problem, one that only came out later. The SOE had been planning its own sabotage operation against Bordeaux, codenamed Scientist. They called it off to stay out of Frankton's way, which meant someone, somewhere, had to sit with the question. Could they have done the same damage without sending 10 men in kayaks to almost certain doom? Even with lukewarm results, the audacity of the cockleshell raid gave a desperate boost to British morale at one of the war's darkest hours. For the Germans, it sowed confusion and paranoia. No port, no matter how fortified, felt secure. Nazi commanders throughout occupied Europe tightened security, diverting men and resources to guard against ghost raids they couldn't predict or prevent. Winston Churchill later gave a more favorable assessment, suggesting that Frankton might have shortened the war by as much as 6 months. Hasler's bold innovation, deploying special forces by kayak, inspired the formation of Britain's elite special boat service, which honors Operation Frankton as a founding legacy. The 1955 film The Cockleshell Heroes dramatized the raid for popular audiences and cemented its place in cultural memory. Today, memorials in Britain and France praise the men who paddled into the heart of Nazi-occupied France and never returned. Lord Mountbatten's words perfectly sum up what those 10 men achieved, quote, "Of the many brave and dashing raids carried out by the men of combined operations, none was more courageous or imaginative than Operation Frankton."